everyone. My name is Iris Cahill Casiano. I'm one of the doctoral psychology interns at Texas A&M University's Counseling and Psychological Services. Today, I'm bringing you video 3 in our Anxiety Toolbox web series, which is focused on challenging unhelpful thoughts. Now, if you've already viewed video 1 and 2, this first couple of slides are going to look really familiar. Here's a quick review of the cognitive model. This basically gives us a way of understanding how anxiety works, okay? And it shows us the relationship between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And sometimes anxiety can work in any parts of this triangle to kind of put us down that anxiety spiral. We're going to really focus on how thoughts feed into that anxiety cycle, how those thoughts end up influencing emotions and behaviors, and more importantly, how if we can change those thoughts, we might actually start to feel better. We also have talked about why thoughts are so important. That's because thoughts play a really critical role in not only starting the anxiety cycle, but perpetuating the anxiety cycle. Thoughts are basically how we understand and interpret the world around us, including situations, people, places, things, everything. And sometimes those interpretations are not helpful. If you tend to be a more visual thinker, these thoughts might also appear kind of as mental images as well. Either way, whether you're thinking with words or thinking with pictures, these tend to form patterns in the way we think. And sometimes these patterns kind of become habitual. But you can always change habits, and that's what we're focusing on today. So, I've outlined a 5-step process to help you challenge unhelpful thoughts. Step 1 is identifying those anxious thoughts and patterns. And then step 2 is assessing if those thoughts are helpful or unhelpful for you. Step 3 is about challenging unhelpful thoughts. Step 4, we work to identify alternate thoughts or interpretations. And then step 5 is we take perspective, kind of look at the bigger picture. Let's dive in. So I combined step 1 and 2 because a lot of this information you'd already be familiar with if you caught video 1 and video 2. So the first step is you've got to become aware of what's going on and what your thought process is like. So essentially, you're identifying thoughts that are you're having in response to anxiety provoking situation. So you're writing it down, recognizing them. Step 2 is asking yourself, are these thoughts helpful or unhelpful? Sometimes anxiety is useful. It lets us know if something is scary or if something is dangerous. Sometimes anxiety is not useful. It's way out of proportion to what the situation might actually warrant. So step 2 is really about asking yourself, like, okay, is this useful anxiety? Is it helpful or unhelpful? And you might also start to recognize some of those unhelpful thinking styles that might be showing up in your thoughts. We talked about this a lot in video 2. For example, some of those unhelpful thinking patterns might be jumping to conclusions, like fortune telling, for example, or catastrophizing, like imagining the worst case scenario is going to happen. So pay attention to what patterns of thinking might be coming up for you. So now that we've got that mapped out, let's dive into step 3. We're really getting into the meat and potatoes of challenging unhelpful thoughts. I'm going to show you guys 2 techniques. Technique 1 is to really look at the evidence for or against unhelpful thoughts. It's a very logical kind of approach to this. And what you're basically looking for is what's the data that supports this unhelpful thought? What's the evidence that suggests that this anxious thought is true? But then you're also going to look at the data that does not support the unhelpful thought. And in most cases, when it's anxiety that's stepping in, there's usually going to be more evidence that doesn't support the unhelpful thought. And then you get to decide based on the evidence, like, hey, is this anxiety provoking thought or this anxious thought actually accurate? And usually it's not, but you would only know that if you look at the evidence. The next thing you can do is technique number 2, which is testing the accuracy of those thoughts. And what that means is asking yourself, hey, are these anxious thoughts 100% true or accurate 100% of the time? The answer to that is usually no, because rarely is anything 100% true 100% of the time. Statistically, that just doesn't happen. But when you use this technique to test the accuracy of the thoughts, you really get to explore and recognize, like, hey, okay, really, how often and how likely is that to happen? As you work on this technique, think about identifying examples when those anxious thoughts have been untrue and how often. In many cases, they tend to be untrue a lot of the time. So then we move on to step 4. Once you've kind of challenged those unhelpful thoughts, now we have to come up with alternate thoughts to kind of replace those. What you're looking for is identifying another way of interpreting this anxiety provoking situation that's more helpful for you. So that might mean considering alternate thoughts that are still realistic and believable, but they challenge the depth of the anxiety, for lack of a better word. What you really want to be careful for, though, is to not jump to a positive extreme. So you might be tempted to go all the way from one extreme to the other in terms of coming up with an alternate thought. That's not what we're suggesting here. And we're certainly not saying just think positive and things will get better. The idea here is not to go to this whole other extreme because that's essentially falling into another unhelpful thinking pattern, right? But instead, you're trying to view the anxiety provoking situation more realistically, more objectively. So you're kind of trying to rationalize your way through it and then come up with an alternate thought that's just as believable, if not more so, again, based on that process of evidence for and against, and looking at accuracy or testing the accuracy. So once you've got through step 4, step 5, take a step back, take some perspective. So with this, what you're really trying to do is look at the bigger picture. Okay, how does that anxiety provoking situation actually impact you in the long run? Okay, what are the values and goals that are most important to you overall? And how does that kind of work with or against that anxiety provoking situation? In other words, can you tolerate some distress in order to achieve goals and live up to the values that are most important to you? And should the worst case scenario happen, how would you adapt? When have you adapted in other situations, and how did that work out for you? Sometimes we have more lessons in our back pocket than we realize when the anxiety has us, in its grip. But taking some perspective might help you kind of realize like where you are in the grand scheme of things and how important or how powerful that anxiety needs to be. So that's a quick run through of those 5 steps to challenging unhelpful thoughts. Let's practice together really quickly. So in this case, we have Chris, a college student, who gets a 69% on an online quiz, feels really terrible, and then thinks, I totally bombed that quiz. Man, I guess I just fail at life. So let's break it down. How can we help Chris challenge that unhelpful thought? Step 1, Chris already kind of did it for us by telling us the thought. So remember, step 1 is to identify the thought, and in this case, it's that Chris totally bombed the quiz and believes they're a failure at life. Let's analyze and evaluate those thoughts in step 2. Are they helpful or not helpful? They're not helpful thoughts. Chris is clearly not feeling good and believes that that quiz was totally bombed and that Chris is a failure at life. So we might also recognize here that Chris is engaging in some unhelpful thinking styles like overgeneralizing, where he's taken the fact that, totally bombed that quiz and now fails at life. Or he might also be engaging in all or nothing thinking. So like totally bombing that quiz equals failure at life. So now in the next step, let's challenge those thoughts. Chris might look at evidence for and against those thoughts and might discover, students have still passed the class with worse quiz grades. Maybe Chris talked to a couple of classmates and realized that's the case. Chris might also realize, you know what? 69% is actually not far from getting a 70%, a passing grade. So maybe didn't totally bomb that quiz. So then at this point, Chris is ready to move on to step 4. They've challenged the unhelpful thoughts and now they're looking for some alternate thoughts. Chris might think, well, I didn't do as good as I would have liked on the quiz. It wasn't a total bomb. Some tutoring might help. Now that, that alternate thought has been thought, um, the next step would be to take some perspective. And Chris might think, in the grand scheme of things, one quiz is a drop in the bucket of my overall performance in college. Taking that perspective helps Chris realize that, this isn't meaning a failure at life and it's not a total bomb. It's helping Chris get over the impact and the anxiety that came up with the situation. So now that you know the basic steps of challenging unhelpful thoughts, I invite you to practice these skills regularly. I've got a worksheet created for y'all called Challenging Unhelpful Thoughts Worksheet, and it breaks it down into the 5-step process so you can kind of work through it as you build those skills. Give yourself time and patience as you practice this, because remember, you're changing thinking habits that may have kind of been in place for a really long time. So, like with any habit, it takes a little time and it takes some practice and patience. But eventually, what we're hoping is that changing the way you think about a situation can help you change how you feel. So thank you so much for listening to this video. I've got some additional information here that might be helpful for you. You can download all of the worksheets in the Anxiety Toolbox series from the CAPS website, including the Challenging Unhelpful Thoughts worksheet I just mentioned. And I've also listed some other helpful resources here, including our Sandbello app, which has a lot of great techniques and strategies for managing anxiety, for example. And I've got some reading recommendations and a couple of helpful websites in case you'd like to learn more about coping with anxiety. So thank you again for listening in and hope you have a great day.